Okay, good evening. Welcome. I'm so excited, to have you all here tonight. Welcome to our implicit, unconscious bias and microaggression panel. My name is Shirley Jefferson. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Affairs and Diversity here at Vermont Law School. I'm also an Associate Professor of Law. I would like to introduce our panelists. Tonight, we are honored to have Mel DeFlorio. Mel is the Senior Director for Enrollment Manager. He is also the co-chair of our Diversity Committee. I have two of Vermont Law School third-year students. I have Arielle King and I have April Urbanowski. So we will be entertaining you tonight and entertaining your questions. Ariel, can you tell the audience how to post their questions tonight? Because we'll take questions and answers after we finish our panel discussion.
Sure. So the method for answering questions or asking questions, there are two different ways. So there are chat functions in both of the places that the live stream is available. So you're more than welcome to just add your questions as we are discussing things. Each of us will have a certain amount of time to talk about whatever we're talking about. So feel free to ask questions throughout the entire panel discussion. However, we won't be answering questions until the end.
Thank you. Okay, now before we get into these biases and microaggressions, we first have to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, the first time I ever heard diversity was back in 1978, and it was used in a case, the University of California Region versus Alan Barkey. He was a white man trying to get into the Davis Medical School, and he was denied admissions. And he said he was denied admissions because the medical school had these quotas, these set asides. They had so many seats for African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, and Asians. And he said that he was denied admissions based on that. Well, the university said, hey, wait a minute. We're trying to correct some of the past discriminations in the past, so we want to make sure that everybody can get in. And so the Supreme Court agreed with him by saying you can't have these quotas and set asides. This man had nothing to do with what happened in the past. But Justice Powell, he said, you know what? I think that you might have been able to get your policy through if you use this word called diversity. He said, Harvard University have something called diversity. And at that time, he was talking about race and ethnicity. And then diversity evolved into a whole lot of other attributes. Now, I will give you a short definition on diversity. Diversity includes all the ways in which people differ, encompassing the different characteristics that make one individual or group different from another. So diversity evolved. So now you're in law school. You're a diverse candidate. All of us have some type of diverse attributes. And now you say, oh my goodness, I want to be treated fairly. I want equity. I want to be able, when I raise my hand in class, that the professor called on me, and the professor won't think because I'm a BIPOC, that's the new word, Black, Indigenous People of Color, member of this class. Don't single me out, professor. I don't want to speak for my whole class. Professor, don't discount my comments and questions because of my culture. And equity means that it is the fair treatment, opportunity, and advancement for all people, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that prevent us from full participation. Okay, so you're in law school, you're treated equal. Now you want to be included. You want to be on the Vermont Law Review. You want to be on the Environmental Journal. You want to be on the moot court. You want to be in these study groups, and you're like, hey, please, I want to be included. But on a lot of predominantly white campuses, BIPOC students are held hostage sometimes because based on some of these stereotypes, which I'm going to talk about soon, that they are perceived to not be as smart as the rest of the students. So inclusive, I want to be included. Inclusive is the act of creating an environment in which any individual or guest can be and feel welcome, respected, supported, and valued to full participation. But see, when you get into equality or equity of inclusion, that's when unconscious and implicit biases start raising their ugly heads. And so you have to start talking about it and trying to find ways and solutions to eliminate that. Now, so we're going to now get into implicit biases because you in law school now. You've been admitted because of diversity sometime. You've been treated equally. Now you're included. And now, boy, since you've been included, everything is happening at you. Everybody got to get educated. The students, the white students, black students, the teachers, the professors, the janitors, everybody. And because we all have biases. Don't let anybody tell you that we don't have biases. Don't let anybody tell you they're colorblind because they're not. Now we have these biases because we got this brain. We have so many gigabytes, so many bytes, so many that we can't control all of them. We can't process all of them. So instead of processing them, we take shortcuts. We start doing shortcuts, which when we do shortcuts, we start stereotyping. We start forming impression on how a person's supposed to look, how's a person supposed to sound, how they supposed to act. Okay, so now implicit biases. Implicit biases is a positive or negative mentality attitude toward a person, thing, or a group that a person holds at an unconscious level. Now, some of these biases, there's a whole lot, like I told you. Some are not implicit, some are explicit. And but the implicit ones, you're not quite aware of it. And Harvard have this implicit association test. I don't have the link right now, but if you go on their website, you should take that test. All of us have biases. They have all types. They have religious. They have gender. I found I have a bias against disabled people. I never knew that, but according to that test, I do. And so we have these biases. And again, you're in your classroom, and your classmate, white classmate, a black classmate, sometimes, but you don't talk like you black. You know, Arielle, you speak very well. You're pretty for a girl. You know, all of these things again have in our mind that we speak out. And so unconscious bias and implicit biases, they run hand in hand a lot of times. Unconscious bias, I would give you a little short definition for that. It refers to a biases that we're unaware of, which happens outside our control. It's a bias that happens automatically. It triggers by our brain, making quick judgment, assessment of people and situations. But it's influenced by our backgrounds, by our culture, our environment, our personal experiences. Women, this is what women are primary caregivers. Husbands are the breadwinners. Husbands are supposed to be taller than wives. Men make more money than women. Men are doctors. Women are not. And so we have a lot of this. But when we get into our biases, the first thing we need to do is be aware of them. This is how you should attack biases, also microaggressions. I'm going to talk about microaggressions, but unconscious biases, implicit biases, you first have to acknowledge that you have them. And then once you acknowledge that, you need to identify how many you have. And then you need to start taking those biases apart and say, why do I have this? Is it something from my childhood? Is it something the people that I hang out with? Am I hanging out with people, the same race, the same ideas and all of that? And then you need to get rid of your biases. And then you need to be mindful of the kickback that will come back. And most importantly, you should apologize if you can. Also, microaggressions. Now, microaggressions are outgrow of implicit biases, but they come in like they're slights or insult. Microaggressions are small daily insults and indignities perpetrated against marginalized or oppressed people because of their affiliation with the marginalized or oppressed group. Like I told you, we all have biases, our professors and all. I remember I used to talk to some of our Asian students, and I would say, "Where are you from?" And they said, "New Jersey." I said, "Where are you from?" They said, "New Jersey." In my mind, I'm like, "You know, you're not from New Jersey. Where you really from?" I really want them to say they're from Asia or somewhere because that's what's my perception of it. You continue to mispronounce a student's name after the student have told you many times how to pronounce it. And it's just these biases and microaggressions, they sometimes run hand in hand. Now, some microaggressions are not spoken but communicated. You clutch your purse when some certain men walk down the street. You lock your doors, when certain people come by your car. But you must address those microaggressions the same way that you address the implicit and unconscious biases that we have. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mel because we're going to talk a little bit more about all of these biases and microaggressions and how to deal with them. So Mel, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Dean Jefferson. And thank you for inviting me as a panelist today. I've been on the diversity committee at the law school since I started over 5 years ago, and we've done a lot of training on microaggressions and implicit bias. And for me, what I really want to focus on in my segment here is where the root of where these actually come from. Dean Jefferson went over what's happening at a psychological level, these knee-jerk reactions, the way we are implicitly biased and how that plays out in the classroom. But I have a quote I'd like to share by James Baldwin to get started. And he said, "If you're treated a certain way, you become a certain kind of person. If certain things are described to you as being real, they're real for you, whether they're real or not." I like this quote by Baldwin because I think it speaks to the power of language and especially the power of implicit bias that exists within our language. This idea that there is in each of us deeply ingrained inherent assumptions that we make about one another and ourselves that dictate, what's normal, what is acceptable, and they're so powerful and insidious that when you're on the receiving end of these microaggressions, these biases, you start to believe that they're true, that they must be real, even though, they don't feel real to you. So where do these biases come from and the microaggressions that go along with the biases? And the answer is white supremacy and colonialism. White supremacy is the belief that white people are superior to those of all other races, especially the Black race, and should therefore dominate society. White supremacy is more than just hooded cloaks and swastikas, which is what people tend to think of when they hear that term. It is the belief that whiteness is assumed, inherently better, and to be given preference. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, I'm white and I deal with microaggressions and biases, so what does this have to do with white supremacy? Why are you making this about race? Yes, as a white transgender man myself and someone who is assigned female at birth, I've experienced my fair share of microaggressions and implicit biases. But I would argue that our implicit biases and the microaggressions that are experienced by anyone are all byproducts of and rooted in white supremacy. Racism is still at the very core of white supremacy, and within this structure exist byproducts of racism and colonialism. Some of these include homophobia, transphobia, fatphobia, sexism, ableism, just to name a few. Because within white supremacy is this notion, this belief that there is a standard, there's a normal that we all must adhere to, and that standard is white, thin, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied, etc. It's this Eurocentric standard on what is to be assumed. And it is the standard against which everyone's worth is measured, with whiteness being at the epicenter of that worthiness. So the closer you are to meeting these standards, the more society has to offer you. So I want to take a moment to dig deep down into your implicit biases, We all have them. We have to acknowledge them. And I want you to think about some of those biases you might have. You see someone, presumably male, wearing a dress. You see someone who's presumably a woman who has a beard. Frame it around the standards of white supremacy beyond, and just how deep that goes. And you'll notice that every time they're rooted in someone holding on to what's normal and who defines what is normal. And essentially, at the end of the day, this normal is created in order to create a power dynamic wherein one person is inherently superior to someone else based on standards set by white colonizers. So obviously, white people benefit largely from this system because we are already the assumed and the default. Even those of us, white people existing within marginalized communities, like myself as a transgender man, come from a place of extreme privilege. So even within my progressive LGBTQ, Bernie-loving Vermont community, I've seen white people use our implicit biases to gaslight Black, Indigenous, and non-Black people of color in order to maintain a position of power over the BIPOC community. I've heard things like, I don't see color. Why are you being divisive? Can't we all get along? All lives matter. This is white supremacy in action. And as liberal and progressive as we might think ourselves, as much as we call ourselves allies, even the most progressive white people will continue to deny their implicit biases and privileges because we will always inherently desire to be the assumed, to be comfortable, because there's comfort and safety in being the default. Microaggressions only serve to remind the oppressed that they are seen as lesser than. Also, I want to point out that implicit biases don't even necessarily happen between people. You can have them against yourself. How many people out there have worried about gaining weight? How many of you are afraid of becoming fat? And why are you afraid of that? Some people will say, oh, it's because I want to be healthy. Being fat's unhealthy. And where does that idea come from? And at the end of the day, there are a lot of reasons people are unhealthy. There are a lot of things that make people unhealthy. But if you're afraid of gaining weight, it's because you're afraid of being seen as lesser than, is not what is normal. Because being fat is not okay within the standards of white supremacy. I've even had my own transphobic biases that I battle with in measuring my masculinity on my, being a man, on how well I can pass as being a cisgendered man, as defined by white European standards for what masculinity is: chiseled, tall, dark, a facial hair, a deep voice, no curves. That is all rooted in Eurocentric ideas of what is to be assumed. So when I go back and think about Baldwin's quote, if we treat people in a certain way as if they are lesser than because they do not meet these standards, then it will start to manifest within themselves that they should feel lesser than, that their existence is lesser because there's no space for them to exist unapologetically and safely at the same time in a world of restricted binaries, in a world where whiteness is the ideal. Where is there space for them to exist? So when you ask a non-white person where they're from, like where they're actually from, you're saying to them that they inherently don't belong here. When someone compliments me, saying that I look like a real man or I sound like a real man, what I hear, what they're telling me is that I'm not actually a man, but rather I'm doing a good job of fooling everyone. Some trans men choose not to take hormones or undergo surgeries, but their gender is no less valid than mine. We call these things microaggressions, but there's nothing micro about them. They shake us to our very core, and then even in the face of these quiet acts of violence, we have to use our time and energy to validate our existence, and must do so politely, in a way that is palatable, so as not to offend the offender, because they are the gatekeepers of being accepted. You're so articulate. You look so exotic. Where are you from? You don't look like a lesbian. You're not fat. You're beautiful. Your hair is so interesting. Can I touch it? So I want to emphasize before I close out what I'm saying here that these ideas I'm sharing, what I'm talking about, is nothing that I've learned in college or school, but It's what I've learned by independently reading and listening to Black femmes and non-binary authors, educators, influencers, and artists over the past several years. And they are owed an incredible debt, and I hope you all take your time to do your research the way that I continue to do my research. Angela Davis, Sojourner Truth, Audre Lorde, Sonia Renee Taylor, Alice Walker, Ida B. Wells. There's so many who have been telling us these truths and speaking against white supremacy and implicit bias and microaggressions for centuries. This is not new. It's just people started listening. So 120 years ago, Sojourner Truth was speaking to a group of white progressive suffrage activists. And she said, "You have been having our rights so long that you think, like a slaveholder, that you own us. I know that it is hard for one who has held the reins for so long to give up. It cuts like a knife. It will all feel better when it closes up again." And I want to end with a quote by Toni Morrison, who said, "The comfort of being naturally better than, of not having a struggle or demand, or having to struggle or demand civil treatment is hard to give up. The confidence that you will not be watched in a department store, that you are the preferred customer in high-end restaurants, these social inflections belonging to whiteness are greedily relished." So when thinking about implicit bias and your microaggressions as white people, I hope you'll reflect on your comfort and what you're willing to give up so that we all can grow and become better places, people, and make BLS a better space for people to exist. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. Speaking of amazing Black women, I'm going to turn it over to Arielle King, who's a 3L here at BLS, and she's going to talk about anti-racism and implicit bias in the legal system and the law school classroom.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name, as Mel just said, is Arielle King. I'm a 3L, and I'm originally from Albany, New York. I'm the co-founder and immediate past co-chair of the Environmental Justice Law Society. I'm a contributor and publisher of the Vermont Law School newspaper, The Forum. I'm the immediate past 2L representative on the Vermont Law School Board of Trustees, and I am a student ambassador, and I'm generally on the other side in the background of these panels because I help with the chat function, which is why Dean Jefferson asked me to explain how to use it today. And so I am so honored to be able to share a little bit of some of the work and research that I've been doing over the last few years, but specifically over the last few months. So I recently started I'm the co-owner of a business called Righting Wrongs, LLC. And one of the main things that we've been doing right now is creating anti-racism policies for school districts, for organizations, and occasionally for municipalities all across the nation. And so what is anti-racism? It is a form of action against racism, systemic racism, and the oppression of marginalized groups. Being anti-racist is based on the conscious efforts and actions of individuals to provide equitable opportunities for all people of an individual or on an individual or systemic level, people can act against racism by acknowledging personal privileges, confronting acts of racial discrimination, and working to change personal racial biases. Simply being kind does not equate being anti-racist. Being nice to BIPOC people does not make you anti-racist. Someone recently shared with me this beautiful metaphor about racism and the act of being anti-racist. And essentially, if you think about it, racism in this way is kind of like a river. And the way that you act and interact with racism is what you would be doing as if you were on a boat. So if you are rowing with the currents, then you are being racist. If you aren't rowing at all, you're being not racist, which isn't terrible, but certainly isn't the goal. That's not what we want to get to. We want you to be rowing against the current of racism, and that's when anti-racism can really occur. anti-racism is also not colorblindness. So Mel and Dean Jefferson both beautifully described how damaging and toxic colorblindness is, the act and notion of not seeing color, because, I mean, and frankly, in my opinion, it's more damaging than actually being racist, because it diminishes the significant part of my identity, something that's inextricably linked to who I am and how I enter into any space and how I interact with people in this world. So I recently read an article that shared 3 different ways your anti-racism is still racist. And I thought that I could share.
Okay. Look like we've lost her signal. Okay, April, you want to take it? Hopefully she'll come back.
Yeah, I can take over, and then we'll jump back to what she was about to say when she comes back. Hi, everyone. I'm April. Just like Arielle, I was also the former co-chair of EJLS. I'm currently a student ambassador. I currently also work under Dean Jay on quite a bit of different diversity projects, and I am the president of Barristers this year. Before law school, I had a career, you may say, in teaching and having engagement within college settings such as like Berkeley, Johns Hopkins. And through that, I've learned a lot about microaggressions and implicit biases. And one thing to do for microaggressions and implicit biases, the only way we're going to get rid of them is confronting them head on. Now, it's difficult and it's tough. One, because you may not recognize that you have an implicit bias or an implicit bias was said. Secondly, in the situations they may occur, you don't feel confident enough to speak up or say something. An example is when I was a sophomore in college, I had an internship, my first internship at a nonprofit within a city, pretty large city, and we had a meeting with all the interns, and I was the youngest intern. I was a sophomore, everyone else was a senior, so I already felt that dynamic. And we were talking about racism and racism in workplaces, and the presenter asked, she was like, hey, can anyone like talk about something they know that is like racist or give an example? And I raised my hand and I was like, did you know that, white women are more often diagnosed with breast cancer, but African-American women die the most from breast cancer. And that's just due to racism within medical fields. And she looked at me and she said, no, that's not racism, that's just different genetics. And at the time, I couldn't say anything or do anything. One, because I was in shock, and two, I didn't know my place if this was the right time to speak up against that microaggression. So later on, I actually quit the internship, and then I wrote them a letter explaining the racist comment that she made, the microaggression that she made, and how it impacts other people. So one thing I really want to dive deep into is allyship. You hear this word so much, and there's a lot of negative floating around with being an ally. What does that really mean? And really, being an ally is just knowing when to step in and when to step out. You really need to recognize who you are. You need to recognize your privilege, your background, and where you come from. You also need to recognize the person that you may be speaking up or group that you're speaking up for. They are more than capable of doing it themselves. It's just that the people listening may not be able to hear them. So some examples of what being a good ally actually means is, sorry, one moment while I flip this. You have to transfer your benefits of your privilege to a group that may be oppressed. And you use your voice and your privilege to amplify those who are being oppressed. You need to acknowledge that even though you feel pain in this conversation and this whole dynamic that's going on, it's not about you. This is not about you. This is not about you saving the day. That is not at all what's happening. You also need to stand up when you feel scared. This is a conversation about microaggressions within the classroom. you have a professor that said something that's a microaggression, you really don't want to speak up in that moment, because we all know what it's like speaking up in a law school classroom. So you need to find that courage to maybe after class go up to Dean J's office and say, hey, Professor XYZ said XYZ, and we really need to focus in on that. Also, you have to understand your own implicit bias. You have to understand the microaggressions you've done in the past. And if you make a mistake or you make a microaggression, apologize immediately and then recenter or decenter yourself from the situation. Sometimes when a situation happens, we really don't know what to do as an ally. So some things that you should be doing, you do need to be open to listening. You need to be aware of your implicit bias. You need to do your own research. As Mel pointed out, who are you reading your books? Who are the people writing your books? Who are the podcasts you're listening to? Who are making the documentaries that you're listening to? Are you reading all sides of media? It's not up to the oppressed or the minority group or whatever group it is to figure out and tell you and teach you what you should know. You need to be doing that on your own. You also have to figure out and acknowledge the ways that you've participated in an oppressive system. That's going to take a lot of soul searching, but you to truly understand and to be the best ally you can, you really need to figure out where your stance is. And then you have to fight against those systems actively, whether that be giving the room to someone who needs it, or if there's a conference going on or a lecture going on for a specific intended group, even though you're really interested, think, is this space intended for me, or should I give this space up to someone else? That could be a way of being an ally. Also, you have to listen, even if it makes you uncomfortable. A lot of times we'll be hearing situations and you will feel uncomfortable, plain old truth, but it's not about you. You need to listen. You need to be that ally. Also, this is a never-ending daily practice. So you're just going to keep learning every day. This will never end. Now, things you shouldn't do is, again, don't expect to be taught by anyone else. Don't compare your struggles. If someone's explaining to you a situation, this is not the opportunity to say, I have it worse or other people have it worse. You acknowledge everyone has stuff going through, but that is not the time to talk about it. You don't take credit. If something's going on and an oppressed person created that beautiful thing, you do not take credit. And you don't assume that everyone you're talking to, because you know you're talking to this group, everyone in this group has the same feeling. That is not true. Now, what happens when someone actually has a situation occur or a microaggression occur? Sometimes what happens is someone will make it about themselves, or they'll try and deny the other person's experience. They'll try and derail it. They'll refuse to center the impact of it. They may do tone policing. They also may deny the problem is actually fixable. They may victim blame and they may withdraw. As an ally, what we should be doing is we should center the impact, step away from the pattern that's going on, apologize for the impact, even though it wasn't your own intent, and you need to listen and learn. So again, microaggressions can happen at any level, and you just need to step up and be an ally. You need to listen to others. You need to learn. You need to expand your horizons, because we don't know everything, and it's going to be a never-ending daily process. And again, always think about what your intent versus your impact is. Even though you're helping, is that actually what the impact is on that group or person? And there's microaggressions all over. Like Mel provided examples. I just provided an example. Another one is you may always hear the phrase, I can't be racist, I have Black friends. That translates to, I could never be racist, I have friends of color, so I think all people are color great. That's not what this is meaning to transfer into. And again, the other techniques is, just say I statements, use logic, relax and check yourself, because you need to know what you're talking about. You need to go out and research and do this education. So the main takeaway of being an ally when in the classroom is be there for the person, listen, respect, And if you can at the time, step up, speak up. Also, if it passes and you still feel uncomfortable, go talk to the higher of that professor or that student. There is always a way to report these things, especially at Vermont Law School. That was my quick and brief allyship not to-do list, but tutorial, I guess. We're gonna throw it back to Arielle. She seems like she's back online.
Yes, so here I am. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but that's what's happening these days in the age of everyone being on technology at all times. I think I was going into the 3 ways in which your anti-racism may still be racist. And so most of these teachings are from an article by Sarah Ahmed, who is like a premier scholar in critical race theory, anti-racism work, systemic racism identification, all of these different processes. And the article is called Declarations of Whiteness, the Non-Performity of Anti-Racism. So one of the first ways is the fact that allyship occasionally can be fueled by anxiety and self-obsession. Just the notion of identifying yourself as an ally and consistently proclaiming yourself as an ally comes off sometimes as self-serving and self-congratulatory unless you are actually doing the work, specifically the work that April was just describing. The article describes it as whiteness that is anxious about itself. So some of the ways to combat that are to stop, listen, learn, and validate the experiences of BIPOC individuals, compensate BIPOC individuals when you are asking them for their time and their expertise and to share their lived experience, because it is sometimes very traumatizing to keep having to relive that and reshare that. Identifying and unlearning your biases, identifying and understanding that our outlooks on the world are different because of our biases and our history. So, my experience as a Black woman in this world is very different from a white person's experience. So just having empathy for what you cannot understand because it isn't part of your lived experience is a very big way to combat the potential issues associated with allyship. Another way your anti-racism can still be racist is if you are critiquing everything and everyone. You cancel people you love instead of talking to them in the name of allyship, which is outrageously dangerous. And I have an issue with cancel culture for a lot of reasons. But, for example, if we're just calling up people's jobs and getting them fired because they said racist things, if there's no follow through, if there's no education, what's stopping them from going into another job and being just as racist? We have to really be intentional about working towards educating people so that we can eliminate racism from our environment. Because otherwise there's going to be a lot of animosity from people who are called racist because, now they're losing their job, they're losing their livelihood as a result of something that they did, and they're not taking ownership because they don't understand what they did wrong. Third is that, you critique nothing. So when white people show up and shut down conversations about racial justice amongst other white people by saying something like, no, just do whatever, insert oppressed person or group says. First, we are not a monolith. So our lived experiences are very different as individuals. And so there's absolutely no way in which we can speak on behalf of our whole race or our whole oppressed or marginalized group. And so, anti-racism work is outrageously important right now, especially because the Trump administration just ordered federal agencies to stop conducting trainings on white racism, white privilege, critical race theory, and I quote, and any other training or propaganda effort that teaches or suggests either that the United States is inherently racist or an evil country, or that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. He called these actions un-American. Identification of these things un-American. And as Mel described, biases are everywhere. We experience bias everywhere. Every person has these biases. And if you are not exposed to people, or if you don't recognize that there is, or there historically has been, an idea of white superiority that has trickled down into every part of human life, American life specifically, then it's going to diminish our ability to move forward and progress as an anti-racist nation. So, another part of this panel, well, the title of this panel is Implicit and Unconscious Bias and Microaggressions in the Law School Classrooms. So, Dean Jefferson did a great job at describing what microaggressions are. I've been really inspired by Ibram Kendi, who talks a lot about anti-racism. He's pretty much the premier voice on anti-racism education right now. And he says he doesn't use the term microaggression anymore. He said it's a persistent daily low hum of racist abuse, and that is not minor. It's equivalent to death by 1,000 cuts. He uses the term abuse because aggression is not as exacting a term. And so he believes that abuse demonstrates the action and effects that it has on people. Distress, anger, worry, depression, anxiety, pain, fatigue, and so much more. And so in order to really understand what's happening associated with implicit and unconscious bias and microaggressions in the law school classroom, I think we need to take about 2 steps back in that thought process. So first, we have to look at the legal system as a whole. All of our laws are created by people. And as we have discussed throughout this entire panel, people have biases. And most of the laws that are created and that govern this nation were created by cisgendered white men at a time when almost nobody else had rights. So as a result, of course, there's going to be bias in the law. Of course, there is room for improvement to ensure that all people have protections under the law. And so in my mind, one of the biggest solutions to working towards that is diversifying government, creating a more inclusive political system where, people of all backgrounds have access to the political system, and where, citizens and those who are governed by specific politicians have access to these politicians and therefore have the ability to hold them accountable to what they said when they were campaigning. And so moving just one step into this thought process is understanding the legal profession and how the legal profession is very white. It's a very white and exclusive club. And, I'll just throw out a few statistics. So in 2019, 85% of lawyers in the United States were white, even though white people made up 77% of the national population. In that same year, there were only 5% of lawyers were African American, 5% of lawyers were Hispanic, and 3% of lawyers were Asian. These statistics had not changed over the last decade, even though demographics in the United States have. Due to gatekeeping measures and other limitations to access to the legal profession, this has been able to persist. So one of the main gatekeeping measures is law school as a whole. Gatekeepers to access of BIPOC community members into the legal profession is law school as a whole. So let's start with the application process. Use of the LSAT, the law school admissions test, diminishes likelihood of BIPOC students, specifically Black students, from getting into many law schools. So for those who don't know, the LSAT scores from, I don't really know what the base score is, but the highest score you can get is 180 points. In 2019, Black test takers, the average for Black test takers to earn on the LSAT is a 142, whereas white test takers, the average is 153. In 2019, nearly half of Black law school student applicants, about 49%, were not admitted into a single law school, and that share is larger than any other racial or ethnic group. Among those with scores in that band of many law school applicants, white applicants were more likely than Black applicants to be admitted if they had the same score, which intensifies the exclusionary effects of the LSAT. Among those scores, among Black applicants with LSAT scores between 135 and 149, 55% received no admissions offers in 2019, but this compares to only 39% of similar white applicants. And as a result of these figures, Black applicants who are admitted to law school enroll at law schools with less desirable outcomes in terms of job placement and other outcome measures than other law schools. And Black applicants who are admitted into law schools, which use LSAT scores for awarding scholarships, are far less likely than those in other groups to receive non-need-based aid, which contributes to having more debt than their white counterparts when they graduate law school and contributes to the economic stratification based on race that our country has. And then if BIPOC students even get into law school, then we deal with a plethora of microaggressions and implicit bias from pretty much every angle. First, the curriculum is often predominantly and inherently white as a result of the foundations of our nation. As I said before, this nation was built with our legal system, at least, was based on, a very heteronormative white status quo. And so as a result, the things that we learn in law school are limited in scope a lot of times. And so I know Vermont Law School is doing a very good job at combating that by considering adding more diverse perspectives into our legal curriculum, and also potentially requiring there to be some type of critical race theory analysis in the work that we're doing and the education that we are providing. We also, as BIPOC students in law school, we have to work about 10 times harder just to exist in the law school space and be actually taken seriously. We recognize that how we do in law school impacts how others who look like us will be dealt with in the future for law school. And as Dean Jefferson mentioned earlier, we don't want to be cold called on behalf of our race. If a case talks about a Black person, I don't want to just be called on just because I'm Black. I want to be called because I raised my hand, And so it's a very different experience. And I also know that when I'm cold called, it's not just a reflection of me. For some reason, we a lot of times are linked in that way. And so what I say and how well I do on a cold call or how well I do in a class doesn't just reflect on me. It reflects on all the other Black students at the school, and it also reflects, potential candidates as they enter into our legal profession. And so as I was preparing for this panel, I thought it was really important to get some perspectives from different BIPOC students on some of their experiences in law school as it relates to implicit bias, unconscious bias, and microaggressions. So, there was a BIPOC student who let me know that a white student was going around telling other students that this BIPOC student only received an internship because the white student had turned it down. Which, I'm not even going to get into that. And so I also reached out to this national network of BIPOC law students, and I asked them to share some of their experiences. So some of the things that people wrote were, I would get an email from my white professor asking why I was absent from class if one of the 2 other Black girls in the class were absent that day, even if she had just cold called me during said class. I made lentil soup with seasonings from my home country for a potluck, and a white student ate it and said that was his ethnic experience for the year. I was at an event at a professor's house during my first week of 1L year with my white partner. Everyone kept asking me how he liked law school, to which he replied that he doesn't attend law school and that I do. Later on, someone asked me whether he was with me to help me with my immigration status. Microaggressions. It is so incredibly hard to be a BIPOC student. If you're hearing any of these things, why would you want to even stay in law school? There's so much hindering us from even being able to succeed in the law school profession, in the law school setting, and then further in the law profession. And then thinking about what's happening right now with this social justice and racial justice reckoning that's happening. Just the fact that so many professors aren't acknowledging that at the start of our classes, or are not giving us extra time to think and breathe and just be, because this is an outrageously hard time, because on top of the protests and everything that's happening, people are dying from a pandemic that we just fully don't understand yet. So there are just all of these factors, and it's taking a toll on a lot of BIPOC students. I'm sure it's taking a toll on everyone, but especially the BIPOC students. And finally, one of the last barriers that I'd like to mention and acknowledge is the bar exam, which is another standardized test. So statistics vary based on racial demographics. This time, we have to pay for study materials out of our own money. We can't get loans because we're no longer students, and we can't work because we're supposed to be studying at least 40 hours a week. If you don't have the money to do that, what are you supposed to do? So that is an extremely elitist and exclusionary system and that is the final gatekeeping measure for which law students may or may not be allowed to enter the legal profession. So those are some of the things that I'd like to share today. And since I am the last person, I would like to open it up for questions. Let's see. And so again, the way in which you can ask questions is to simply put them in the chat of either the Vimeo live stream or the Facebook live stream, and we will get them that way.
Arielle, there's a question for you that says, do you have any suggestions on how to best educate? For climate states, some states are starting to require climate change education in schools. Do you think something similar would be effective?
In terms of like racial issues, I'm sorry, I didn't hear part of your question. Would you mind just repeating it, please?
Yeah, so it is, do you have any suggestions on how to best educate?
Okay.
And then I think
yeah,
an example of climate change.
Example of climate change, got it, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that there should be critical race theory, understandings of intersectionality, taught at every level of education, starting in elementary school. Because if I, as a Black person, has to experience racism that young, then people should be able to talk about it and, learn about it and understand how to work against it that young. And it doesn't have to be like as far in depth as, talking about specific instances or talking about like the true issues associated with the history of racism, but it can be done and it can start at a very young age. And there are like tons of resources that are happening and circulating all around the internet right now. So there's really no excuse for ignorance at this point. There's so many free resources.
One question we have to the whole group of us, the four of us, is can someone explain culture appropriation? Where's the line between sharing culture and bias?
Sharing culture and bias, where's the line?
Does someone want to take that?
Well, I can. So in terms of cultural appropriation, would be instances of, for example, white people wearing dreadlocks or wearing certain styles that are, have historical significance or cultural significance with non-white groups of people. And I think to me, and just from what I've read and heard, because I can't speak for BIPOC community, but it's just this, the feeling like, and this goes back to what I was talking about with colonialism and this need to feel entitled to someone's culture when it best suits you, because there are parts of certain cultures that have been looked down upon and viewed as lesser. As I was saying, like it's lesser than, you're not as good as, and then white people come along and say, actually I want cornrows, and then they decide that they want that when it suits them. So I don't think it's ever appropriate to appropriate someone else's culture. It's not sharing, it's not appreciation. You can appreciate and respect other people's cultures without appropriating it for yourself, is my take on it.
I don't have anything to add. I don't know, Arielle, or you. Beg your pardon?
I think a big level.
No. Go ahead, April.
I think a big part of it is also education, and really diving deep into it, because the way culture, like Cinco de Mayo is a huge example of like how it may be not celebrated in the way and respected and educated in the way it should be. So just like what Melo was saying, but also like that deep dive of education into what you are trying to celebrate or respect. There is a question for me that says, do you have any advice for empowering people to be confident to address these biases in the moment when they happen? I also think anyone on this panel can ask it, but for me, it is, even if the microaggression isn't at you or the bias isn't at you, you're still probably shocked and taken back that it was stated. My advice for the confidence to say it is, it's better to be said in that moment and have that moment of education rather than have it sit and simmer with the class or the people. Also, it's that moment of, you know, that allyship of when to stand up and when to sit down. And there's not a good, you know, potion to take to have immense courage to, you know, stand up to these people that may be doing microaggressions, especially if they're professors or supervisors. It's just really living to your values and living to your actions. If you say you're an ally and one of this situation happens, it's, you know, being bold, correcting the situation, or not correcting the situation, but addressing the situation and following those steps. Does anyone else out of the four of us on the panel have any advice?
I would say too, just when that when it happens, when you see it happen, you experience it, and then you don't say anything or you don't address it, just think of whose feelings you're protecting inherently in that moment, and you are protecting and why are you protecting those feelings, and just really reflect on that, because I think that's our instinct, is you don't want to embarrass, usually, like, if it's the white person or if it's the straight person or the cisgendered person, why are you protecting them? And start thinking about the marginalized person who never gets that protection.
April, I would like to go back to the previous question that Mel was talking about, you know, the cultural. I don't have a problem with the white person that want to have dreadlocks or a white person who want to act black. Because after all, to me, it seems like they're trying to assimilate into a culture. Look at us. Look at my hair. I'm trying to assimilate into the American way. But these are different opinions. And we as people, we have to accept different opinions. We have to accept the differences. But we have to be mindful and we have to be sensitive to people. Arielle, you just mentioned that the president was cutting down on all of this diversity training and implicit biases. It doesn't have to be the government. It's the people. It's the people. I believe in the power of people. I come from the civil rights era, and I believe that people have to make the change, not the government. It must all begin with us. And starting with law school, you talked about law school. Yes, I think that and I don't want students to be emailing me telling me that we need to start right away. But I think the first year curriculum need to be overhauled to where it eliminates racial biases and disparities and oppression. Because the textbooks that we use, they all perceive the legal system as being fair and neutral. It's not. It has institutional and systemic racism in it. And if a professor or any of us fail to tell you all that, then we've lost you. So I just want to say I don't have a problem with anyone who want to imitate any culture, not just this, because we do it all the time. We do it all the time. And so we have to accept everybody. And that was me just thinking, and I want to go back to that one, but you could pick up another question now.
Thank you, Dean J, for adding into it. So the next question is, does this problem, microaggressions and bias, exist for Hispanic students too?
Oh, God,
it
exists for everyone. Yeah. It exists for everyone. We all have biases in mind. We all have stereotyping. We all have a brain that is doing shortcuts. We all have it. If you say that you don't, then you're not facing up to the first thing, that you have a bias or a microaggression. No, it's embedded in us. It's us. It's part of us. These biases and microaggressions, they are us. They're part of us. And so the first thing you have to do is acknowledge them. But yes, we all, I'm sorry, there's no one out there who don't have it. We all fall short. And we need to check our implicit and unconscious biases, and we need to check our microaggressions. And we need to check our privileges, not only just white privileges, but all of the privileges. There are so many privileges that we have. And a lot of times you dwell on white privileges, but there are other privileges out there. That we've got education, bourgeoisie, but bourgeois, as my daddy would say, uppity folks with privileges. We all have them. We have all have done something in this country to make us the way that we are on the backs of somebody else. And so we all realize that we're in this boat together. We're not, you was talking about voting, we're not going to get out of it.
I know this is a story from an actual third-year Vermont Law School student here who identifies as Hispanic. When she came to South Royalton and VLS, she met with a group of other Hispanic students, and she does not speak Spanish. And one of the students actually said to her, she's like, "Oh, you're not actually one of us because you can't speak Spanish." So the microaggressions against Hispanic students are happening, and unfortunately, they're happening on our campus too.
That's actually a hypothetical in my book that I use for Race and the Law. We discussed that. Yes, they expected this student, she wanted to join a study group too, but she couldn't speak Spanish and they wouldn't let her in. And so it happens. Sometimes you think it's hypothetical, but that's real life.
Okay, so the next question is for me, and it says, what tools would you suggest as an ally for talking to my non-racist parents? So your parents are not racist and you still want to share information about them, just clarifying that, or talk to, or your parents are racist. I'll go from both angles then, because I'm not quite sure what exactly it was meant to be. So if your parents may have a racist viewpoint and you want to talk to them while being an ally, one thing to do is talk from logic. These conversations are so emotionally filled. It can go from 0 to 100 very fast. So take care of yourself, relax, talk from logic, talk from experience, and that may be one way to do it. It's also just, I think, growing up in a family that may have some relatives that don't view the same things I do, I've learned to just continually put it on the table and continually talk about it. Eventually, they became more open and accepting and having these conversations. Now, if your parents are non-racist and you want to talk allyship with them, share the tools of just education. That's the biggest one that I like to say. Education, standing up, being bold, knowing, looking at where you're receiving your resources, even the littlest thing of like who wrote your book, who's speaking in your podcast, to who made your dinner at takeout. Are you supporting these communities? Does anyone else in the panel have anything they would share to suggestions?
Yeah, I was trying to find the name of this one book, but it essentially is for people who are non-racist, right? Like not inherently working towards, oppressing certain groups, but also not.
Yeah, it just says ally for talking to my quotes non-racist parents. So.
Yeah. So I would imagine that has to do with like the three associations that I mentioned, like being racist, being not racist, and being anti-racist. And so like that middle ground is kind of tricky, right? Because they're not doing anything that inherently contributes to the racist structure, but like their inaction is contributing to the racist structure. So like I think one, identifying that as an issue, and then just talking about ways to move towards being non-racist to being anti-racist. And there are tons of books and resources available on being anti-racist. One of them is from Ibram Kendi, and it is literally entitled How to Be an Anti-Racist. And there's a workbook that you can work through with your friends and family or with yourself on how to really attack that process, because it is a lifelong process of decoupling like what you know and what you've learned in terms of race and just in terms of your life and living that have contributed to your interactions and how you enter this world.
How are we defining racism or racist? How are we defining it tonight?
As us in a panel?
Yeah, how are we defining it? Because we've said it a lot of times. When I said racism, about institutional racism and systemic racism, I was thinking about, let me see, I was racist. I was thinking about going back to what Mel has said. I think about one group of people who think that they're superior over another, and they want to keep the group that they think are inferior down. And so they enact laws and policies and procedures to keep it down. And that I don't want to use the word that they hate or dislike. I don't know if it's my part of my definition saying that they dislike people who don't look like them or think like them, or is it just that they want material things? I hope I'm explaining it. I don't know.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And just to follow up on that, so there is an incredible law review article by this woman named Cheryl Harris. It was written in the early 90s, and it's called Whiteness as Property. And essentially, it's talking about exactly what Dean Jefferson is referring to. So if you think of whiteness as a literal property right, in which, like, if you have it, you want to do everything in your power to protect and maintain it. So sometimes that means oppressing other groups, harming other people or hindering their progress in order for you to maintain that property right, which is whiteness. So in my mind, like, that's what I envision racism to be, is like embodying racism as, whiteness as property, and doing actions that contribute to you preserving your whiteness at the expense of other people, not having the same or equal rights or access.
What do you think, Mel? How do you define it? How would you perceive it?
I think that racism is because race was created as a social construct to uphold certain people into power. So this idea of race was created very specifically for now, as we call us, white people, so that we can maintain power over others. And so to me, that is racism is upholding a superiority, upholding power, and hoarding power over others, and using race as the reason to do that. And this long history of how that has evolved in this country and in this world. It's evolved in such a way that now racism plays out in the most insidious kind of, in terms of microaggressions, ways that I think racism has been attempted to be addressed through the power of the law, but within those laws, it's still been intertwined in such a way that it almost makes it harder to deconstruct, as I think Arielle alluded to earlier.
April, what do you think?
I think what everyone has said is true and accurate as a definition of how we are describing racism. I think one thing we should really also note on, because microaggressions and biases can happen to everyone. So we're also not only talking about racism, but we're also talking about disabled, can't think of that word, all the different, either if you're able-bodied, if you're not able-bodied, if you're gay, or if you're straight, if you're cis or you're transgender, that happens to the whole spectrum of microaggressions, women, female.
I asked that question because I was called a racist about maybe 3 or 4 months ago. because of the speech I gave. And I really was just talking about segregation and living in segregation and all of that. And I wasn't going to go back to the way that it was. And that I wanted this country to live up to its creed, live up to the Constitution, and make it free for everybody. So that's why I asked it. And so I thought about it. I said, well, maybe I was a racist. I don't know. That goes back to what you said that a Spanish student said, can they have microaggressions or biases? I don't know. Uh, but it just, a lot of times people say, oh, because I'm black, I'm not. Well, it made me think. I said, maybe I was a racist. I don't know. I was only telling the story, on this. That's why I said I wanted us to go back. And I kept hearing the word and it sort of triggered me because when you're called that word, it doesn't matter what color you are. It's hurtful and it stays in your mind. Yes, yes. And that's why I was trying to go back and say, let us try to define it, what it is, and all of the rest. So I just wanted us to kind of backtrack, a little bit because and that's what we talk about microaggression, implicit biases, and all those things. They're hurtful to people. You can get in a deep depression. That's why we need to check it. And that's why we need to be aware and be mindful of it. So April, you can go to your next question.
So this one is again for all four of us, and it's, what do we need to do to make law schools more inclusive?
Well, we need to overhaul the whole system. First of all, like we just talked about, to not just, I think, when every subject matter that we have, criminal law, torts, civil procedure, property law, all of it has laws that were meant to keep these laws here started off to keep indigenous people and black people in bondage and to keep us in our place. And so some of them have tried to evolve over years. They have put things in places, like the Civil Rights Act, the Voters' Rights Act, the Immigration Act, all these things. You try to put things in place, but you have to teach to the whole class. You have to tell them inside of this is embedded with this, with that. And then you need to teach them how to address it. Now, when the Voters' Rights Act was chipped away, when they did away with the pre-clearance, okay, states started enacting all of these voter suppression laws, everything. And so people were wondering, well, how are you going to now attack discrimination based on voting? Well, it was another provision over in the act itself that said that you can't discriminate. So you have to teach folks how to get through this stuff. You need to teach them how to circumvent it and how to implement new laws. And I would say Professor Joan Bogle is good at the Title VII on that act and and she teaches employment discrimination, all of that. But she'll tell you all about it, and she'll tell you how to do it. We got to teach you all how to strategize. We got to teach you how to get in there and make new laws. Don't be afraid. Make new laws. The laws that we have, they're not for us anymore. We evolved as people. And so we have to train you all to think like that. That's just my spiel on what I think needs to happen to the legal system. Of course, y'all have ideas.
Yeah,
Arielle,
I would say just like,
laid it out.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you laid it out and you talked about LSATs, right? And you talked about accessibility and where does that even start? But if the law school is going to do anything, if law schools, I'm not going to, and all of higher education really wanted to take a deep dive and look at the history of these practices, the history of standardized tests, they're doing exactly what they were designed to do. And in a lot of ways, we had affirmative action, we had all these measures to say, no, you need to improve diversity, you need to include people, but there were things happening on the back end within affirmative action of, all right, we'll let them in, but we are not going to make it affordable, for example. So, it's really going to be dismantling a system, and so where to begin, I don't know, but I think that there are some things that the law school could start to do. Yeah.
And just like you said, Bill, we're talking about all law schools, but then Arielle, let's go back to what you said. Yeah, we have to start with the LSAC, Law School Admissions Council. They know that test is culturally biased. They've said it. But when they were talking about it, taking the test over in India, and when they realized that some of the questions that they had was biased to folks who lived in India, they changed them. So many times the National Bar Association, the NAACP, everybody have been telling them that, but they won't change it. Then we have to get to the ABA. ABA said we embrace diversity. When they put this rule up there that you have to pass the bar with this percentage and you must do it in this time at that time, because they know the majority of BIPOC people don't pass the bar the first time, they'll pass it the second. But they put all of these barriers and all of these things like they want you to succeed, but they don't. On that, then you got to go to the AALS, the American Association of Law Schools. You got to get into there. Then you got to get with these bar examiners. Then you got to get inside these corporations. See, what the civil rights movement did was just to integrate a public accommodation. It was restaurants, bathrooms, hotels, motels, trains, stations. We didn't do no integration and breaking down systemic racism in these corporations. We didn't. And we didn't break down the neighborhoods either. Neighborhoods, churches, still one of the whitest institutions in this country. And I'm saying that we have to backtrack in order to move forward on some things, but it's just not us. Like I said before, it's everybody. They starting with that damn news. Oh, many use profanity. What's that news report or whatever the students look at that rank schools? If schools say we're not going to even pay that any attention, U.S. News and World Report. If they say we ain't gonna pay that no attention, the students say we ain't gonna pay no attention, what's gonna happen? Now we don't need nobody to tell us to do that, but we as people have to do all these things. And that's why I say it takes a lot to get to where we're going, but it might all happen at one time. The whole building might come crumbling down. I believe that's what we're in now, the way that things are going. It's either gonna crumble down or we're going to move around. We're going to get it. Either this whole America, the way we know it, is going to change, or democracy is going to really, really move up high. I don't know which way, but it's up to the people, on that. But it takes all of us. What's your next question, April?
All right. So the next question. So I will say I think we'll only have room for 1 or 2 questions left because we're 10 minutes till. But our next question is for all 4 of us again, and it says, could you speak on the difference between allyship and compliance? As law students / faculty, wouldn't you fall more into compliance when it comes to social and radical justice? Would anyone like to take the first jump at this? If not, I can speak on behalf.
Well, why don't you go right ahead on that one?
So I think, again, this session was titled Microaggressions Within the Law School Classroom, and everyone on this panel is tied to the Vermont Law School community. Going beyond allyship in this world of compliance is you're just doing it because that's what was instituted. Allyship is not that. That is doing more. You will face these microaggressions and bias everywhere you turn, whether it be the grocery store, your workplace, the movie theater. So allyship is more. If you're just doing compliance, you're doing what Arielle was talking about, where you're rowing or you're not really moving the oars, and you're just on the river.
Right.
That is not enough. To be an ally is to really, row against the current and be rowing. As law school students and faculty, when we fall in that category of compliance, that's, to me, is like maybe the barely enough. Like, you're barely doing anything if you're falling into compliance. You should be striving to be that ally. And sometimes I think there's a negative connotation when you say the word compliance when it comes to social and radical justices, because it just seems like I'm doing this because I have to, rather than I'm doing this to strive to make sure the world I am living is better when I leave it than when I first arrived. So the difference is compliance isn't enough. Allyship is the striving if you're doing allyship appropriately.
Great.
Yeah, I think on that as well.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Arielle.
Mel.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think the question spoke about allyship versus accomplices. And like if that is the case, then in my mind, the question is asking whether we are working against the system in support of like BIPOC people or marginalized groups, versus whether we are contributing to the system because we are lawyers, right? And so in my mind, that to me indicates that we need to, as lawyers, be thinking about ways to do movement lawyering. And so that notion and that phenomenon is associated with supporting communities, advocating on behalf of communities, going in and asking communities what they want, as opposed to just coming in as the big bad lawyer and just being like, here's what you need to do. This is how you need to help yourselves, or this is how I'm going to help you. And so in that sense, we need to just validate the lived experiences of community members in which we are advocating on behalf of. We need to uplift their voices and validate the work that they've done before us, and just provide just enough legal expertise for their advocacy to get to the next level. So in my mind, that's a way to be an accomplice because we understand the legal system, but it's also being an ally because we can work to advance initiatives that are going to further anti-racism, LGBTQIA plus different issues. Like, there are just so many ways in which we can be effective allies as attorneys. So that's my answer.
You know what,
And
April,
then
there is a question. I finally was able to hear these questions. This last one, number 8. If you see, it say as a white.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No,
We've been jumping around just so we can make sure we cover a lot of different topics. But do you want to jump into the question, Nate?
Yeah. So as a white male, middle-aged law student, I find out I'm a horrible person who has no life worth. We hear a microaggression. I experienced microaggression. How is this addressed? I just said that everybody experiences microaggressions and implicit biases. And if you experience it, you should say to the person, it's hurtful what you just said to me. If you're saying that the things that we've said to you are hurtful, then we'll say, okay, let's start, tell us why it's hurtful to you. And let's try to deal with it and try to talk about it. That's what I'm saying. We can try to talk and learn. I will learn why you feel that the things that we've said, I'm going to use myself, has been hurtful to you. And I'm going to try to talk to you why I said those. And that's what you do. You talk, you have to tell the people. And so you're telling us that you feel worth. You shouldn't feel worthless. This is just part of life. If you want to talk to me or talk to anybody else, you can. I will try to help you to address it. And that's the first thing, is I want to find out, what did we say? What did I do to make you feel that way? And then we'll try to address it on there, the best way that we can. But these conversations are difficult. They are uncomfortable. Every time somebody walk away hurt, mad, angry, name calling, I've been doing this for 20 years, and every one. That's why people don't want to talk the way we're talking tonight, because it's difficult and it's hard.
Yeah.
And you get
Yeah.
called names and all everything else, but you can't let that stop you. So I'm sorry. I said apologize. Didn't I just say earlier? Somebody said that you something you said or whatever. You apologize first, and then you try to figure out why was it hurtful that I said that, and then we can talk about it. We'll try to dissect it, and then we'll say, okay, if I decide that what I said was a microaggression that hurt you, then I'm going to try to figure out why I said it. Then I'm gonna work on not letting it happen again. I'm gonna be mindful of what happened, and then I'm gonna have to look for kickbacks that it might come back again, but we'll become more aware of what we're saying and how we do it. So thank you. I want to first thank you for putting your question out here and asking us. Thank you. So
we are at 7:27. We could ask one more question, or Dean J, if you have any closing announcements, it's your call.
Well, I'd like for each one of us to close. So why don't we start with you, April? Then we go to Arielle, then we'll go to Mel, then we'll come to me.
Yeah. So thank you guys so much. Oh, okay. So thank you for being here virtually, sharing this space with us. Hopefully these conversations have given you a drive to dive deeper. Again, combating microaggressions and bias is an everyday work. Being an ally is an everyday work. You're never going to be perfect at it. You have a lot of life to unlearn stuff that you were taught when you were younger. No one's the perfect person in these scenarios. Everyone faces microaggressions, but if you have enough to fight against it, please, in that moment, speak up if needed and hopefully educate those around you. Thank you again for tuning in.
All right.
Yeah, I think my first thing is vote. Make sure you have a plan to vote this year. Make sure that that's concrete. You know what you're doing, and that's extremely important this year. So just make sure you're getting out to vote. We're not telling you who to vote for, but we are telling you to get out and vote. The second thing is, just educating yourself and understanding that as a white person, I would encourage you to continue just understanding and sharing and thinking about empathy and listening. And so, that's my main takeaway that I hope that people are walking away from.
And
Okay.
I would say that I want to, especially for white people or people who are not in predominantly marginalized groups, to recognize the difference between experience of microaggression and experiencing your own white fragility. They're very different things. So if you feel away, if you feel uncomfortable, that's a good thing. It's like going to the gym, you work out and it hurts, but you're growing from it. So just make sure that when someone's calling you out or someone said something, and if you feel away, if you're a white man or if you're, able-bodied or whatever it might be, and you feel kind of defensive, that there's a difference between a microaggression and feeling defensive because of your own fragility, and really exploring that. So that's my final closing words.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank all our panelists. I'd like to thank the audience for being here tonight. And I just would like to say that all of us need to check our implicit and unconscious biases, our microaggressions, and make sure that every campus, especially our campus, across the country and the world, is an even safer and more inclusive place to live and learn. I hope that we all have learned something tonight. I know I have. And let's try to continue it in our own daily lives. And thank you. And you all be safe. And good night. I'd like to thank Emily Potts and Teresa Johnson, and also Taylor and Sarah for helping us tonight. Thank you all. Good night. Hang in there.